Imagine waking up one morning to find that every dollar in your bank account, every paycheck you've ever earned, every retirement fund you've carefully built over decades has been converted overnight into a new digital currency you never asked for. Your phone buzzes with a government notification. Your balance is intact. But from this moment forward, every single transaction you make, every coffee you buy, every bill you pay, every donation you give, even every purchase you make in cash that gets traced back to you later, will be watched, recorded, and potentially restricted by algorithms you will never see and officials you will never meet. You try to withdraw cash and the ATM flashes red. Daily limits have been temporarily reduced for national stability. You try to send money to a friend and the app asks why. You try to buy something the system decides you don't need and the payment is quietly declined with no appeal. This is not the plot of a dystopian movie. This is the endgame of a plan that has been circulating in the highest levels of global finance for years, a plan that carries the codename Project Sandman, and the most terrifying part is that the first irreversible steps have already been taken while most of the world was looking the other way. The name Sandman comes from an old intelligence term for an operation designed to put an entire system to sleep, gently, quietly, irreversibly, so that when it wakes up, everything has changed and there is no way back to what once was. In classified briefings and closed-door meetings at the Bank for International Settlements at the IMF, and inside certain offices of the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank, Project Sandman refers to a coordinated sequence of events that will collapse confidence in the current dollar-based global financial order in a single weekend and replace it with a network of central bank digital currencies that give governments and central banks unprecedented visibility and control over individual economic behavior. The planners do not see this as tyranny, they see it as survival. The global debt mountain has grown so large, now approaching $400 trillion when you include unfunded liabilities, that the only way to prevent a chaotic default cascade is to reset the entire monetary operating system before. The bond markets do it for them in the most brutal way possible, and the dollar, as the world's reserve currency, sits at the very center of the bullseye. To understand how close we are, you have to go back to the quiet panic that gripped the financial elite in the autumn of 2022 when the British pound nearly collapsed. After a single ill-judged budget announcement, in the space of 48 hours, pension funds began blowing up because of leveraged bets on government bonds, and the Bank of England was forced to intervene with emergency purchases that nobody had seen coming. Insiders who were in the room that week later described a chilling realization. The entire interconnected web of derivatives, repo markets, and dollar swap lines could unravel faster than anyone could react if confidence in just one major currency cracked at the wrong moment. From that weekend onward, a small circle of central bankers and finance ministers began gaming out what a controlled demolition of the dollar system would actually look like, not because they wanted to destroy it, but because they became convinced that an uncontrolled demolition was now inevitable, and the only question left was who would hold the detonator. The first phase of Project Sandman was never about announcing anything dramatic. It was about preparation. Over the last 3 years, more than 130 countries, representing 98% of global GDP, have been quietly running central bank digital currency pilots. China already has over 300 million citizens using the digital yuan in everyday commerce. The European Central Bank has moved its digital euro project from research to active preparation for launch. The Bank of England has published detailed technical designs for a digital pound that would sit alongside cash, but eventually replace most of it. And in the United States, despite public political theater about resisting CBDCs, the Federal Reserve has been running Project Hamilton and Project Cedar at the Boston and New York Fed branches, testing systems that can process hundreds of thousands of digital dollar transactions per second with programmable restrictions built in from day one. These are not theoretical exercises, these are dress rehearsals. But a digital currency is only half the equation. For the new system to be accepted, the old one has to fail first, and fail spectacularly. This is where the Sandman sequence becomes truly frightening. Declassified planning documents from the IMF's 2023 reserve currency transition exercises describe a scenario in which a sudden spike in U.S. Treasury yields triggered by foreign creditors quietly reducing dollar exposure forces the Federal Reserve into an impossible choice. Either let interest rates explode and bankrupt the government through trillion-dollar annual interest payments, or print money on a scale that triggers a hyperinflationary spiral and collapses the dollar anyway. The documents lay out a third path, a pre-planned circuit breaker weekend in which the president, citing national financial emergency, signs an executive order closing the banks for 72 hours, during which time all existing dollar balances are converted at par into FedCoin, the U.S. central bank digital currency that has been waiting in the wings. International swap lines are frozen, stock and bond markets are halted, and when the system reopens on Wednesday morning, every American wakes up to the new reality. The architects of this plan insist that ordinary people will barely notice the difference at first. Your balance will show the same numbers. Direct deposits will still arrive. Debit cards will still work. But underneath the surface, everything has changed. The new digital dollar is programmable, which means the issuer can decide how long money stays valid, where it can be spent, and even who is allowed to use it. During the COVID lockdowns, we saw trial runs of this concept when stimulus payments came with expiration dates and restrictions on certain categories of purchase. In the Sandman scenario, those emergency powers do not sunset. They become permanent. The Treasury and the Fed have repeatedly tested systems that can freeze accounts flagged for disinformation, reduce balances as carbon penalties, or block transactions to merchants the government decides are undesirable, all in real time, all without a court order, all justified under the banner of financial stability and national security. What makes this plan politically possible is the carefully cultivated myth that the collapse will be someone else's fault. The public narrative is already being shaped. China dumping treasuries, rogue crypto billionaires, Russian cyber attacks, domestic extremists hoarding physical cash. Any scapegoat will do as long as the blame lands far away from the institutions that borrowed trillions they never intended to repay. By the time the banks reopen and the new digital wallet app becomes mandatory for receiving government benefits, paying taxes, or accessing healthcare, most people will be too exhausted from the preceding crisis to mount meaningful resistance. The media will frame acceptance as the only path back to normalcy. Dissenters will be painted as dangerous cranks who want to prolong the suffering. And the few who try to opt out will discover that life without access to the new system is almost impossible in a world where cash has been deliberately starved of circulation for years. Yet the deepest betrayal is not the surveillance or the control. It is the erasure of decades of saved wealth in the blink of an eye. When the dollar dies, every fixed income asset denominated in dollars dies with it. Pensions, annuities, whole life insurance policies, treasury bonds held by grandmothers and firefighter funds, all of it becomes claims on a currency that no longer exists in its old form. The government will claim that conversion to the new digital dollar protects account holders from total loss, but the new unit will immediately enter a period of managed devaluation as the authorities try to inflate away the legacy debt. 10 or 20% annual inflation becomes the new normal, sold as a necessary adjustment rather than deliberate theft. A lifetime of work evaporates not in a dramatic crash, but in the slow, grinding erosion that follows the switch, until the middle class wakes up one day and realizes they own nothing of real value anymore. There are still powerful factions fighting against this outcome. Parts of the American political class have begun to understand that whoever controls the launch narrative of a US CBDC controls the future of economic power on the planet, and they would rather delay or derail the process than hand that power to unelected technocrats. Legislation has been introduced to ban central bank digital currencies outright, and some Federal Reserve regional presidents have begun publicly warning that programmable money is incompatible with a free society. But the momentum is not on their side. The debt clocks keep ticking. Foreign central banks keep diversifying away from dollar. Reserves at the fastest pace since the 1970s, and the plumbing for the new system is already built and waiting. So what can an ordinary person do when the most powerful institutions on Earth have decided that the only way out is through your savings? The first step is to refuse to be surprised. The Sandman plan only works if the public is caught asleep. Every month you have left in the old system is a month to reduce exposure to what is coming. Physical assets that cannot be reprogrammed or frozen at a keyboard. Gold and silver held outside the banking system. Real estate paid off in full. Productive farmland, energy infrastructure, even basic commodities that will always be needed. These are the things that retain value when a currency regime dies. Bitcoin and privacy-focused cryptocurrencies still offer a parallel escape hatch for those who understand how to use them responsibly, though the window for accumulation without government scrutiny is closing fast. Most important of all is community, networks of trust with neighbors, family, and like-minded. People who can trade goods and services when the official payment rails begin to discriminate. The hour is much later than most people realize. The preparations are no longer theoretical. The pilot programs are graduating to full deployment. The crisis that will be used as justification is being allowed to build rather than being diffused, because crisis is the only politically viable trigger for what comes next. Project Sandman is not a prophecy. It is a contingency plan with a countdown, and every day that passes without serious pushback brings us one day closer to the weekend when the old dollar goes to sleep forever. When that weekend arrives, there will be no second chances, no appeals process, no way to opt out once the new system is live. The architects believe they are saving the world from a worse collapse. History will record whether they were right, or whether they simply delivered the most sophisticated theft of individual freedom and wealth ever orchestrated under the guise of an emergency. The choice that remains is not whether the old system can be saved, it is whether you will face what replaces it awake, prepared and resolute, or whether you will wake up in the new world with nothing but a government app on your phone telling you how much of your own money you are still allowed to spend today.